Well, good evening and welcome back to the fourth and final of the four-part series, or eight-part, four-night series, this year's Winter Quest. You may have noticed the features of the room. This is actually one of our major classrooms at Concordia Lutheran Seminary. Sorry, Joel, I'm not talking about you as the feature. But here is one of the places where we hold classes on a regular basis. We use the smart screen to do a lot of things so that our students can have the best learning experience. It's always the connection between students and the content. What the faculty provide is part of that. But we're here, as our mission states, to form servants for Jesus' sake. That includes our pastoral students, our diaconal students, but also it includes the laity of the church. And we're really glad, whether you're part of ministry with a capital M or ministry in some other way, we're glad that you're here. And we're thankful for Dr. Heck and for his expertise in the writings and the life of C.S. Lewis. This evening he's going to go through, he'll say a little bit more about what he's going to cover, but the adult fiction arena, which I read years and years ago, find fascinating. But before we go any further, let's start with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for all the ways that you are at work in our world. We thank you for the creative talent that you gave to C.S. Lewis and the genius behind what he wrote to convey the message of the gospel so that we might learn from it, so that as it points to Christ, we might better understand the message of the redemption that God sent through Jesus Christ our Savior. We ask that you would help us to learn to appreciate what that is, to allow the message of Lewis to be able to point us further toward the proclamation of praise to you. We recognize that all good theology leads to doxology, and we're thankful for what that means in our lives. Bless us tonight and guide us by your grace. Through Jesus we pray. Amen. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my president, my colleague and friend, Reverend Dr. Joel Heck, who is going to finish up the series tonight. Dr. Heck?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. You know, C.S. Lewis was known for his book, Mere Christianity, where he focused on the core teachings of the Christian faith. I want to start with a story that illustrates kind of the opposite. He wouldn't have appreciated this story about a man who was walking across a bridge one day, and he saw another person standing on the edge about to jump off, so he ran over, and he said, "Stop, don't do it." "Why shouldn't I?" the other guy said. Well, the first man said, "Well, there's so much to live for." He said, "Like what?" Well, the first man said, "Well, are you religious or atheist?" He said, "Religious." First guy said, "Me too. Are you Christian or Buddhist or Confucianist?" He said, "Christian." First guy said, "Me too." "Are you Catholic or Protestant?" He said, "Protestant." First guy said, "Me too. Are you Episcopalian or Baptist or Lutheran or what?" He said, "Baptist." And the first guy said, "Wow, me too. Are you Baptist Church of God or Baptist Church of the Lord?" And the guy said, "Baptist Church of God." And the first man said, "Me too. Are you Original Baptist Church of God or are you Reformed Baptist Church of God?" And the guy said, "Reformed Baptist Church of God." And the first guy said, "Well, me too. Are you Reformed Baptist Church of God Reformation of 1879 or Reformation Baptist Church of God Reformation, Reformed Baptist Church of God Reformation 1915? He said, "Reformed Baptist Church of God Reformation 1915. And the first man said, "Die, heretic scum," and he pushed him off. Well, that's not exactly agreeing on the core teachings of the Christian faith, but we're not going to go there. And in a certain sense, I suppose I should apologize for avoiding, I didn't really avoid them, but for not selecting any of the three major areas of writing that Lewis is famous for, most famous for: Mere Christianity, the Screwtape Letters, and the Chronicles of Narnia. But one thing I like to do is kind of go in directions that people don't ordinarily go, and the Ransom Trilogy, the Cosmic Trilogy, the Space Trilogy, it's known as all three of those, is one of those categories. So I have okay, I'm messing up with the screen. So here are the 3 years of publication. Out of the Silent Planet in 1938. There is a one-page summary of the plot of Out of the Silent Planet that you may have picked up on your way in. If you're interested, you'd like to get a snapshot of it, decide whether you want to read it or not, or maybe that will substitute for reading it and you'll kind of know the plot. I'm going to tell the plot of all 3 books in much shorter fashion in the course of the evening. But so there's the plot. The other 2 I could have given you a summary at, but I couldn't get it all on one page, at least not easily. So I just gave you the plot of the first one, maybe to whet your appetites. So 1938, Out of the Silent Planet. I'll explain that silent planet thing in a bit. Paralandra, 1943, and if you'll notice, there's Paralandra. This is Earth. Thulcandra, Paralandra is Venus. Virotrilbia is Mercury. Malacandra is Mars. Andra is a word in Old Solar, a language that I think Lewis thinks he invented, or maybe somebody else did. It means Earth or the planet as a whole. So you see that Andra feature in all those names. Jupiter's Glundandra. Saturn is Lurga. Neptune is Neruval, I guess, but he doesn't talk about those very much. So these 3 books, the third one, 1945, the longest of the 3 is called That Hideous Strength. I'll explain where that title came from also. But these 3 books together, Lewis once described as theological science fiction, and certainly science fiction they are. In 1960, they were reissued, republished, and The Observer, one of the British publications, said the theology creaks much less loudly than this reader remembered, and it is a joy to encounter a writer of science fiction, I don't know whether Dr. Lewis would have said to that description, who responds to the notion of an alien planet with excitement and wonder instead of bored familiarity. So at least one reviewer, upon the reissuing of these books, really liked them better the next time around. I have to admit that Hideous Strength is one of the 2 books that I just did not like the first time I read it. The other one is Surprised by Joy, which has some really great passages as well as some not so great ones, at least in my opinion. But before we go any further into the trilogy, I just want to give you an update. I checked out YouTube. We are at 298 views for week 1. So went up a little bit the last week, 174 views. For week 2, last week it was 148. For week 3, it was 125 views and a couple more subscribers, so 384 CLS subscribers. And I don't know about you, but I was looking at that. Concordia Lutheran Seminary, CLS, if you just change the letters, the order of the letters, you have the initials of C.S. Lewis. I mean, there's something going on here that's almost divine. Anyway, I like to play with words and letters and things of that sort, so did Lewis. And so I just want to share a few other lighter moments with you as we get started, because we only have one topic this evening. We'll just break at 7:50, 7:55, and take 10 minutes, and then we'll see if it takes us to 9 o'clock or 8:50 or whatever it is. We'll go there. So in an East African newspaper, somebody wrote in English, a new swimming pool is rapidly taking shape since the contractors have thrown in the bulk of their workers. I don't always know what they're saying when English is their second language. Car rental firm in Tokyo, when passenger foot heave in sight, tootle the horn, trumpet him melodiously at first, but if he still obstacles your passage, then tootle him with vigor. Okay, well, you think about it, it makes sense. Lewis wrote a book called Studies in Words, where he looked at about 6 or 8 words, their history, their context, their origin, and what the word really means in their etymology and usage today. So he loved words, and as an English professor, he was the master of word usage. He would get a kick out of this, I'm sure. A Slovakian tourist agency. Take one of our horse-driven city tours. We guarantee no miscarriages. Detour sign in Japan, stop, drive sideways. I think that meant detour. I got a couple more, so just in case you haven't chuckled yet, or as my wife says, have you found your smile yet today? Occasionally, you're slow getting going in the morning. Swiss Mountain Inn, special today, no ice cream. What? I don't get that. Anyway, Austrian hotels catering to skiers. not to perambulate the corridors in the hours of repose and the boots of ascension, which I think means don't walk in your ski boots at night in the hotel. In a Hong Kong supermarket, for your convenience, we recommend courteous, efficient self-service. Okay, well, it might be courteous and it might not, depends on what kind of a mood you're in or if you found your smile yet today. Budapest Zoo, please do not feed the animals. If you have any suitable food, give it to the guard on duty. Okay. All right, so if you don't remember anything more about tonight, you will leave maybe with a couple of funny sayings. Of course, we don't write them down, or maybe David's writing one of those down now, but if anybody's interested, I can send you this whole PowerPoint or a couple of slides, or if you want, what was that joke about the Tokyo detour? Okay, so we are looking at science fiction, space travel in Lewis's imagination, and he wrote these books before space travel became something significant, but there are a lot of people that loved to write science fiction about space travel. He loved science fiction, and he got into the swing of things. Remember the name of Arthur C. Clarke from last week, who had predicted the geostationary satellite system of communication that is in existence today about 20 years before the first satellite was launched. That's the age, 1957, that the first satellite, Sputnik, the Russians beat us into space with the first satellite. First weather satellite, 1960. April Fool's Day, I wonder if there's a reason for that. First human in space, again, the Russians beat us there, Yuri Gagarin, April 1961. First astronauts on the moon, I think it was JFK that got the US moving to have the goal of putting some astronauts on the moon and getting there ahead of the Russians. We did that. Neil Armstrong, you know, the famous statement, one small step for, what was it, one giant step for mankind. Armstrong and Aldrin, 1969. Since the early 70s, Soviet space stations, Skylab space stations, space shuttle flights, reusable rockets, various satellite missions to distant planets and beyond. 1973, first spacecraft to fly past Jupiter. 1989, first spacecraft to fly past Neptune, the Voyager 2. International Space Station built between 2000 and 2011, so things are moving along. And in fact, isn't the U.S. in the process of sending some people back to the moon now? They're 50 years after it happened, they are getting ready to send some people to the moon again. By the second decade of the 21st century, I did just a little bit of search on the internet, more than 50 countries had space agencies. Wow, the world has changed. And part of the reason I say this is not just because of the Ransom Trilogy. I like to call it the Ransom Trilogy, Space Trilogy, Cosmic Trilogy, but Ransom highlights two things. Number one, the key character, the good guy in all three stories, Elwin Ransom. Number two, because of the meaning of the word. In fact, in the second book, Ransom is bemoaning his case in Paralandra, and he's battling against this evil scientist, and he hears this voice that kind of hears him complaining, and he hears this voice from the heavens that says, "My name also is Ransom." Well, I think we probably know what's meant by that. Well, C.S. Lewis wrote an article long after the Ransom Trilogy called Religion and Rocketry, published in 1958 for the first time, under a different title, Will We Lose God in Outer Space? Was written in response or partial response to the writings of Professor Fred Hoyle, the Cambridge astronomer, who championed the steady state theory of the universe before Hubble changed things dramatically, and we now pretty well, everybody accepts that expanding universe rather than one that's not expanding is stationary. And I guess the expanding universe is challenged in some circles, but I'm no expert in that field. So Lewis writes this essay, relatively short essay. I'd be happy to send it to you if you wanted to read it. Starts with Lewis proclaiming two equal and opposite scientific proposals. One, that life only began on Earth with the rarest of accidents, and two, which Hoyle proposed, that life probably began in many places. And there are a lot of people that really hold on to that to this day, hopeful that there's some evidence of life in other places because it'll somehow give credence to their atheistic positions. Both positions, Lewis wrote, claim to show the absurdity of the Christian belief in divine origins and the incarnation of Christ. Does that seem odd to you?
I would think it would come together.
Two opposite arguments, worlds apart, and yet they're both used to argue against Christianity. I don't think you can have it both ways, but I think that's an indication of the desperation of the anti-religionist, anti-Christian. Why you would say, well, Christianity can't be true because it happened here by accident. It can't be true because there's nothing unique about it. It probably happened in hundreds or thousands of places, and that disproves the Christian faith. Well, I don't think either one does. And so Lewis makes that point, and then he asks some questions, or says, if there is life in another planet somewhere in a distant galaxy or our own galaxy, we got to ask some questions. Number one, are there animals anywhere else besides Earth, or creatures anywhere else? If yes, do any of these animals have what we call rational souls? That is, are they spiritual beings? Thirdly, if there are such spiritual beings, are any or all of them like us fallen? And in the first two books of the Ransom Trilogy, the creatures on Mars and Venus are unfallen. If any of them have fallen, have they been denied redemption by the incarnation and passion of Christ? Christ could have come to those worlds also. Finally, if all the first four questions could be answered yes, is it certain that this is the only possible mode of redemption? So he's asking some questions for which we still don't have the answers today, but at least it illustrates the fact that the two arguments, it's a rare accident or there's life in a lot of places, can't really be used to demonstrate the implausibility of the Christian faith. I wrote an article about this essay, Religion and Rocketry, and it's up on the HarperCollins website. You can still find it if you go to www.cslewis.com, and you can search. There's a search box, or you can do /religion and rocketry. And this is one of 8 or 10 or 12 articles I wrote for HarperCollins. They had this idea that they would promote the life and writings of Lewis by getting various people that knew Lewis to write articles. And so I wrote something about this essay, which I found kind of fascinating and connected to the Ransom Trilogy, even though it was written long after these three books. So let's get into the first one. I know some of you were reading the summary of this book in that one-page handout before we got started today, so I will give you a snapshot summary of this. The key character, actually three, but Elwin Ransom is the main person, the good guy in all three stories. He is a philologist of Cambridge University, and his model is probably J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a philologist too, someone who loved words. That's what philology means. Edwin Weston is a brilliant scientist. Dick Devine is an academic, kind of like Dr. Gimbel and I, except we're not bad guys, right? We aren't, are we? Okay, I hope not. Elwin means elf friend in Anglo-Saxon. So Lewis loved to do things with words, and had he been here this evening, he would have probably laughed the loudest of all of us when I was sharing those signs in the English language other countries put up in their hotels and their walkways and the like. Malacandra is Mars, an unfallen world. At Malacandra, there are three types of creatures: Prosa. Give you a picture of one. I don't know how they were able to get that picture, but anyway, somebody must have gone there and found it. They are the hunters. Fiffletriggi are the craftsmen that can make all kinds of things, and the Sorns are the intellectuals. 3 different types of creature, all of them unfallen. It's a sinless world until Weston and Divine get there, and then they come back to and they bring Ransom along the next time they go there, because they mistakenly think that the creatures of Malacandra are looking for a human sacrifice. The Sorns particularly, except they've totally misunderstood the creatures of Malacandra because they don't understand language. Fascinating that the key character is somebody who does understand language and learns the language of Malacandra fairly easily. So this is I mentioned this earlier, so I stole my own thunder, where the voice in Paralandra says, "My name also is Ransom." So there is an interesting parallel. There's also a place in the 3rd book where Ransom injures his heel, and his heel is bleeding for, I guess, roughly the second half of the book. And it turns out that that's an echo of Genesis 3:15. You will crush his head and he will strike your heel. And at the end of the last book, Ransom is somehow transported back to Paralandra in order to allow that wound to heal now that the good guys have won in the end. By the way, Arthur C. Clarke, mentioned him earlier, and OSP is my abbreviation for Out of the Silent Planet. And if you'll excuse me for quoting myself, I mean, that's kind of tacky, I know. But the book No Ordinary People, I found that Arthur Clarke complimented Lewis for rejecting the idea that anything alien is likely to be ugly and horrible, as in the case of H.G. Wells's books. Anybody ever heard of the book The War of the Worlds? Published in 1898, one of Wells' famous books where creatures from other planets come and invade the United Kingdom and wreak havoc. And I think I read that book. In the end, I think these Martian invaders die because they're susceptible to bacteria that infect them and kill them, and that's how the English get out of that tight spot. At any rate, why do aliens have to be viewed as ugly, horrible, violent? They are coming here to conquer our world, and maybe they're just curious or peace-loving and want to learn from us and teach us. Who knows? Okay, let's get into the plot a little bit more. So longer version on that handout and a shorter version here in the PowerPoint. Dr. Ransom, Cambridge academic and philologist, student of language, is abducted and taken on a spaceship to the planet of Malacandra. His captors, Weston, who has invented this means of space travel, and Divine, the academic brains behind this plot, are hoping to plunder the planet's treasures and to offer ransom as a sacrifice to the creatures who live there, because they mistakenly think, with their inability to understand language, that that's what the Sorns especially want. Ransom discovers he has come from the silent planet, which is Earth, whose tragic story is known throughout the universe. There are, 9 planets? Do we count Pluto now or not? I mean, it's on again, off again, dwarf planet, real planet. I don't know, I kind of like the number 9. Isn't it 9? Yeah, so I don't like the idea of demoting Pluto because some scientists said it's not big enough, but oh well. So the other 8 planets aren't silent. We'll explain that a little bit more as we go along. So this is an unfallen world with aliens that are not evil or grotesque. Alien simply comes from the Latin word meaning stranger. Somebody we don't know. Isn't a judgment, although I guess we can't talk about aliens today. If somebody comes into our country from another country without authorization, we're not supposed to call them aliens, especially illegal aliens. But alien is a good Latin word. It simply means other. Each planet has an angelic creature who rules over that planet, called an Oyarsa. And there is an Oyarsa on Malacandra who's good and kind and wise and ends up summoning Ransom and Weston and Divine to an island where they have kind of a powwow. And there's a really humorous section in that story, but I think I may have told a little bit about in that handout. So after they get there, Weston and Divine end up killing one of the creatures in Malacandra, and the Oyarsa doesn't like that, so he calls them and he basically banishes them from the planet. They got to go back home, and Weston has to figure out, given the angle, the location of the Earth and Mars, whether they can make it or not, with different orbits and so on, and how much oxygen you would have. They do make it in the end. But anybody know the name Sheldon Van Auken in the book Severe Mercy? If I had to come up with a list of the top 10 books I've ever read, this book would be on it. Fabulous story. Van Auken was a U.S. citizen English professor, good writer, who met C.S. Lewis and who was converted to the Christian faith, always by the power of the Holy Spirit, but Lewis was very instrumental in that, and some of the letters that you'll read in the, I guess it's the third volume of Lewis's collected letters, were written to Sheldon Van Auken, sort of helping him along on the road to the Christian faith. And it's Lewis that talked about the death of Sheldon's wife prematurely through some rare liver disease, that was a severe mercy from God, because God knew that his marriage relationship was almost an idol in his life, and so he took Davy, that was her name, and this book, Out of the Sight of Planet, was one of the influences in his life, and Van Auken in the Severe Mercy says the trilogy showed me that the Christian God might, after all, be quite big enough for the whole galaxy. That's a Harper and Row or HarperCollins book if you're interested, and a great read sometime. It's the story of his conversion. It is a story of him meeting Lewis, studying in Oxford and mingling with the Oxford people, his marriage, a deeply loved, two people very, very much in love, and the tragedy of her premature death and how Lewis helped him through that. And then later on, when Lewis lost his wife to cancer, Van Auken returned the favor. Just a tremendously powerful story. So I recommend it. At any rate, Van Auken, a thinker, a writer, an English professor, no longer alive, but he wrote this about Out of the Silent Planet, that the Christian God might be big enough for the whole galaxy. So according to the medieval mind, and where Lewis was very much a medievalist, loved the Middle Ages, the literature of the Middle Ages, the music of the spheres meant, this is a phrase used in the Middle Ages about the solar system, that each planet sounded a note. And if there's harmony among the planets, all the planets would sound that note and form a beautiful chord out there in the solar system. One planet, unfortunately, is ruled by a fallen angel. I think we know who Lewis means by that, who does not participate in this harmony, because these other worlds are all unfallen, sinless worlds ruled by one of God's angels. I guess an archangel would be roughly the equivalent of an Oyarsa. So it doesn't make the sound. Lucifer doesn't like to sing along with the other angelic creatures, so he doesn't participate, and so that makes Earth the silent planet, hence the title of the book. One other note, when Ransom for the first time sees the Earth from Malacandra, he's not sure where he is. He knows he travels through space. He might be in another galaxy, another solar system, might be our own solar system. He's not sure how fast things are going, and he was unconscious for a time. He was drugged by Weston and Divine to kidnap him and get him on board the spaceship that Weston had built. And when he sees the Earth from the surface of Mars, Earth is upside down, which is not an accident. It's, we'll see that in the next slide. I've read a book by Marjorie Hope Nicholson, kind of a famous English professor and writer in the 40s, 50s, 60s. She calls Out of the Silent Planet the most beautiful voyage novel ever written. I mean, something of an authority on literature. So if you've never heard of Marjorie Hope Nicholson, I hadn't heard of her until about a year ago, and I read a book of hers. So here is, you can find almost anything on the internet these days. So you can look up and find out who's the Old Testament professor at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, who's writing the Concordia commentary on the book of Genesis. Vernon was talking about, who is that? And I couldn't remember David Adams' name, but that's who's doing it. So there is South America at the top, where it belongs, right, Martin? And North America at the bottom. Okay. So, like I said, Lewis was very much a medievalist. He studied the literature of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and literature throughout the history, believed that the English curriculum ought to stop at the year 1830 because literature written since that time is much more a product of our own age, and students will read it and understand it more naturally. They don't need to be tutored in that. But when you go back earlier than the Industrial Revolution, that's the kind of literature that we really need to read. So he thought that after Jane Austen's death and a couple other people that died around 1830, that was the end of the age of great literature. So he once wrote, most of my books are evangelistic. That's the essay, he said it. And one reason why he liked the literature of the Middle Ages is because it was God-centered. And as you probably know, the stuff that you read today, most literature, books of any kind, textbooks, newspapers, does anybody read a newspaper anymore? Internet articles, all kinds of literature is very man-centered, almost ad nauseum. And so Lewis, I probably felt that the more the literature of the Middle Ages is understood and appreciated, the better our world will be in terms of its ability to connect with God and return to a right relationship with our Creator. So the Middle Ages were God-centered. And in fact, most of what Lewis wrote was intended to promote many of the ideas of the Middle Ages. Probably his first collection of essays was entitled Rehabilitations. Personally, I see Lewis trying to encourage his readers to recapture the God-centeredness of the Middle Ages. A guy by the name of Wesley Court wrote a book that I read some time ago and wrote down a couple of four quotations from Court's book, C.S. Lewis, Then and Now. The medievals, under the influence of Plato, Court writes, tended to think that it was not possible to join two things together without a third to mediate their relation to one another. Things come in threes, which sounds a bit Trinitarian. He said Lewis's view of culture as mediator between reality and belief also seems influenced by the deeply rooted relations of English culture to Christianity. In the fourth book of his Republic, Plato describes the parts of the soul as first the appetites, second the spirit or emotions, and the third is the reason. So reason he located in the head, the emotions in the chest, and the appetites in the belly. And there's a place where Lewis says the head rules the belly through the chest. So as we have trained emotions, trained responses, we are able to, with our minds, to tell our moods where to get off. The three kinds of creatures on Malacandra corresponded to the three kinds of humans who lived there. Divine was like the Fiffletriggy, the craftsman, Weston like the Sorns, the intellectuals, and Ransom much more like the Herosa. So maybe to bring this all full circle and apply it not only to Out of the Silent Planet, but also to the human personality, following Plato, Lewis saw the human personality consisting of three concentric circles. At the center is our will, where we make decisions to behave in a certain way or not. The next circle is the intellect, and the outer circle is the imagination. And so he believed that in order to communicate truth to people, we need to first reach their imaginations. And so the Chronicles of Narnia and the Ransom Trilogy are imaginative stories, and people love stories. I mean, I think probably everybody in this room does. A good story is something that's captivating. And so when somebody tells a story, we can picture it in our mind. There are images that form in our minds, hence imagination. And if you draw somebody in through the story, through images, you have a chance of reaching their intellect as they think about, oh, so there's a lion in one of the Chronicles of Narnia that dies and rises again. I wonder, has that ever happened? And the lion is the king of beasts. Sounds like maybe representing a kingly figure. Who wonder who that might be? And so they think about some of these concepts, what bravery is, what sadness is, what faithfulness is, those kinds of things that are lived out by the four children of the Chronicles of Narnia. So the imagination, especially for kids, but also for adults, that reaches the intellect, and then as we think through, use our reason to process these images, it can impact our will and the way we act and behave. And I think Lewis is doing that in the Chronicles of Narnia and in the Ransom Trilogy. Let's move on to Paralandra. It's a supposal. In fact, Lewis said the Chronicles of Narnia were all supposals too. But let me just ask for a show of hands, see if any of you will raise your hand to this question, because I would raise my hand in response. In fact, I will, even before I ask the question. How about that? Have you ever wondered what might have happened if Adam and Eve had not eaten the forbidden fruit? Anybody wonder that? Maybe easier would be who hasn't wondered that, because we all look at the story and then, Adam, Eve, why did you do that? Well, Lewis did too, and he wrote Paralandra to tell us not what he thought might have happened if Eve had not taken the fruit, but to speculate about another world in a similar situation, and maybe to do a little bit of rehabilitating of the Genesis story, which when Lewis was writing books in the first half of the 20th century in Oxford, the biblical story was not well thought of in Oxford. So speculative theology, scientific theology. So it is a supposal. And you remember from 7 years ago when I lectured on the, no, I'm just kidding. I described the Chronicles of Narnia as supposal. Supposing there were a world that was unfallen, and supposing a tempter came with a temptation, and supposing there was somebody that might also came to try to blunt the impact of that tempter. Or in Narnia, supposing there were a land where it was always winter and never Christmas, and supposing Christ came to a land of talking animals, might he not also come as a talking animal? He's just supposing, he's not trying to say it happened this way or could happen this way, but he's just creating a story. And as Narnia began with the picture, so did Paralandra. In this case, a picture of floating islands. That's the floating island from the cover of one of the many editions of Paralandra that were published by several different publishers. So he writes about reality in story form, not that there are people living on Venus even to this day, but he's speculating, he's writing a supposal, he's having fun with it. He wrote a letter to a Mrs. Hook. His correspondence was voluminous. He wrote thousands and thousands of letters. So he writes in 1958. So this is 15 years after Paralandra was published. Suppose in some other planet There were a first couple undergoing the same that Adam and Eve underwent here, but successfully. So the outcome is different in this story than it is in Genesis. And of course, it'd be better if he wrote that letter before he wrote Perelandra, but oh well. I mean, he's aware of what he wrote, and maybe Mrs. Hook has never heard about that book. So let's take a look at Perelandra, published in 1943, a book that Lewis liked more than any other of his books, or so it is said. He thought that Till We Have Faces was his best book. I disagree, but this is a good book, and he liked it best of all. Dr. Ransom voyages to Venus. In the first book, it's to Mars. This one is to Venus, and you notice the Andra ending is, again, the Earth or the planet, the whole planet. He voyages to the paradise planet of Perelandra, which turns out to be a beautiful Eden-like world that is covered, probably 95% water on the surface, and it's got these floating islands. He's also horrified to discover his old enemy, Dr. Weston, who had been there on Malacandra, kidnapped him, drugged him, and kidnapped him to Malacandra, has also arrived. Divine's not in this picture at all. He comes into the third book. But Weston and Ransom are there, and Weston is trying to cause the Perelandra's Eve to fall into sin. Her name is Tinadril. The Adam of Perelandra is Tor, and the Eve is Tinadril. I mean, the names themselves have a certain ring to them, a pleasant sound to them. So he's trying to get her to sin, and Ransom is trying to prevent that from happening. So Weston's body is taken over by the forces of evil. It's almost a demon possession, as Weston at one point invites this spirit into him, and he's taken over by this evil spirit. Ransom engages in a desperate struggle during which his heel is wounded to save the innocence of Perelandra and his first two humans, Tor and Tinadril, the Adam and Eve of Venus. And at a certain point in the story, he's thinking and he's praying, he's sort of talking to God, and he comes to the realization that in order to stop Weston from succeeding, he's got to engage him in mortal combat. And they fight to the death, and Ransom wins. Deliver us from evil, I guess, would be one way of saying it. Walter Hooper says that the theme of the book is, how can a totally free person without unfair manipulation by God spontaneously carry out what God most desires and find yourself a destiny which God fully intends? Ransom realized that Tinadril was weakening, that Weston was gradually gaining the upper hand, and that if he didn't intervene in some way, Perelandra was going to fall too, just like Earth had. So that's when he realizes he has to fight Weston to the death. And he's afraid, a demon-possessed person, as I've heard or read testified to, has almost superhuman strength, but for some reason there was no more strength in Weston's body than, well, because the author decided that he wouldn't have any more strength. I mean, the author has a certain amount of power in the ability to decide who can do what and how things are going to roll out in this plot line. Fascinating story. It was well reviewed back in '46. Leonard Bacon, whoever that is, probably a book reviewer, The Poetic Imagination in Full Blast. John Gilland Bernini, the book can be ranked high in the fields of creative imagination, speculative theology, and engrossing adventure, far superior to other tales of interplanetary adventures. And again, aliens don't have to be horrifying or violent or ugly, so I suspect Arthur Clarke liked this one too, although he does, Clarke takes on Lewis because of these books, but Clark was very much a science fiction writer and lover, and so he read Lewis and violently disagreed at first, but then they kind of became friends. So Bernini says, yeah, far superior. Victor Ham, the substance of this wonderful scene, that is a description of the Oyarsa of Mars and the Oyarsa of Venus, which culminates in a grand chorus of praises to Mal-el-Dil. That's Lewis's name for God, is an inspired litany of love and homage. Okay, so anyway, some people back then positively reviewed it. I suspect if you were to look for reviews of it, maybe even on Amazon, and find any one of the 3 books reviewed there by people who have read it, it gets some pretty high marks. So we're done with 2 of the 3, and I think we have time to start into the 3rd one. That Hid His Strength, 1945. So, oh, yes, question, Jim, okay.
You said you didn't really like that book
This
the
one.
first time you read it.
Yes.
Can you explain why?
Yeah, I think I can. Partly because it's weird, but there's a society in England that's trying to take over the country, and very wicked bunch of people. They form a society, take over a university, and they end up, they're involved in demon worship even though they don't realize it. They have an individual who has been sentenced to death. He's decapitated, kind of gruesome stuff, and they end up getting the head of this guy and sticking tubes into it and trying to convince themselves that it's still alive. And the reality is that these evil spirits are speaking through this decapitated head that's preserved in a particular room. And I mean, part of it's just gross, but it's also Lewis describing in story form where he thinks the world is heading. And it's partly intended to shock so that people will realize, I don't think we want to go there. Of course, some do, but and that'll play itself out a little bit more clearly in the storyline or the retelling of the plot. And by the way, I do have a summary of all 3 books in my notes, but the first book is a couple hundred pages, this size, and the second book is twice that length, and then the 3rd book is almost twice as long as the first 2 books combined. So it's a long book. It's got some unusual characters. It's got a friendly bear that becomes a friend of Ransom, sort of a testimony in Lewis's mind to a bear that he saw at the Whipsnade Zoo that he nicknamed Mr. Bultitude. And so he's called that in this story. There's also a tribute to his former tutor, W.T. Kirkpatrick, in a very rationalistic character called Arthur McPhee. But this actually would be a good time to stop, I think, and take a break. And so why don't we do that?
Is there another question earlier?
Anybody else have a question?
Do you have a question earlier?
Well, I had just wondered what year before when we were talking about. That's okay.
Yeah, the year publication of the 3 books, 38, 43, and 45. But maybe you're referring to something else. We can talk at break time too. So shall we stop here? This is a good breaking point.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you. Again, mastery of the content, mastery of the overview, and all the things that C.S. Lewis is trying to help us better understand. And we, Dr. Heck is world class, as you know, in his understanding of Lewis, and we're really thankful for that. Just a comment about one of the hats that Dr. Heck wears while he's here is that he works with the placement. I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago, that we are thinking that there may be either 4 or 5 of our students who will be going out into the church some on internship or vicarage, some into the church for their final step.
One of whom is in this room right now.
Yes, so and thank you, Martin, for being our videographer today and also keeping up with your studies. He's a good student, and we're really glad to have him here. But again, it's not just about the students that are in the traditional format, but we try to serve the church as broadly as we can, and we're really thankful for that opportunity. Let's take a break, and I don't know if you're at home, if you've got as much on your table spread out during the break time as we do. Thanks to both Ellen and Nancy, who have been every week working hard to prepare things so that we don't starve. There's a risk of that, but we're not going to starve this winter. And I hope that you enjoy the fellowship, and the time will start up again in about 10 minutes or so. All right? Thank you. Heck, I don't know, Dr. Heck. Judging from what you said about the page count, we're a little behind, right? If we've gone not quite halfway in the first, not quite a quarter of the way.
Slide 26 of 46 slides.
Okay, well, all right, we're okay. We'll make it through, because if we don't finish tonight, then you'll have to come back in the fall. What a great idea! Let me just say this. Well, in fall, Dr. Heck is going to be back again. We'll try and finish up the fall quest before I almost said Lent, but we're in Lent now. But in the fall, we'll try and finish up before the Advent season. So probably somewhere the last part of October and in through November, Dr. Heck is going to do 4 more in the next quest series. And I don't even know exactly. Do you know what you're doing then?
I put a few notes down. I definitely want to do an hour on A Grief Observed, which is his sort of mournful memories of his wife and how he dealt with the loss of his wife to cancer. But it's been a very powerful story that has ministered to a lot of people. So I think I'm going to do that one, maybe do something on Christian witness, what Lewis says about Christian witness. Maybe I'll take requests from you and say, okay, what else should I talk about? The book Miracles, or we haven't really talked about Mere Christianity or Screwtape Letters, partly because I think maybe you're somewhat familiar with those, but we could do either one or both of those. Yeah.
All right, very good.
Just a quick thing, did you
I turned it off to save battery power. Thank you.
Now you'll need to repeat everything you just said. If you want to know what he's talking about, he gave some ideas of what he's working on for the fall. I think he's doing Tolkien. Just kidding. Just kidding. And anyway, we welcome back Dr. Joel Heck for part 8 of our quest series for this spring. And Dr. Heck?
Thank you.
And I think you have a question right there.
Question.
Can we go a little late tonight if we're not getting to where we need to go? Or maybe that would be better than.
Well, I'll tell you what, we could officially end at 9 o'clock if I'm not done by then, which I think it will be. And anybody that wants to go can. Those that want to stay, they can also. I want to put in a little commercial for the oldest periodical dedicated to the life and writings of C.S. Lewis. This is called CSL, and Bulletin of the New York C.S. Lewis Society. It's the latest issue, just arrived in the mail. The lead article is the story of Alistair Fowler, who was one of Lewis's graduate students, and what it was like to have Lewis as a tutor and a teacher at Cambridge University. So this is a reprint of an article that appeared in Yale Review in 2003. But at any rate, this comes out 6 times a year, and one of the publications that's worth I think it costs $10 a year. So I always send them 25 because I know postage, especially to send it to Canada, is a little bit more. But I would commend this to you, and if anybody wants to look at it, I could let you page through it. I read that opening article and enjoyed it a great deal. So that's one of the big publications. I'll talk about one other a little bit later on, but let's get into the plot and background to That Hideous Strength, whose title comes from the line of a poem written in 1555 by David Lindsay, referring to the Tower of Babel. I've never read the poem, so I can't, that's a rabbit hole I decided not to crawl down, but if you want to look up David Lindsay and what he said about the Tower of Babel, you'll probably find, I'm sure you'll find the phrase, that hideous strength. So the story is set on Earth, tells the story of a terrifying conspiracy against humanity. So whereas the first 2 books involve space travel to other planets, this book involves space travel from the Oyarsas of the different other planets that aren't silent coming to Earth. Story centers on a young married couple, Mark and Jane Studdock, who aren't getting along real well throughout most of the story. Mark is a sociologist. Never trust a sociologist. No, just kidding. There's some very fine sociologists, but he's invited to join an organization called the NICE, National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, which is not nice at all, and it aims to control all human life. So there is the will toward totalitarianism, and it seems like in many parts of the world, lots of ideologies, lots of philosophies for governing a nation tend towards totalitarianism unless it is tempered by things like goodness, truth, and beauty, or a faith in God. Meanwhile, Mark's wife Jane is having bizarre dreams, prophetic dreams about a decapitated scientist named Alcazan. This is the guy who's been executed, and the people at the NICE are trying to keep his head alive because they think somehow through the advance of science they can defeat death itself, and this is one of their early experiments. They're also doing animal and human experimentation, trying to create some more effective, more powerful, more intelligent forms of life. What did I just do there? Okay, I touched it the wrong way, so I'm going to have to recapture this because I don't have a mouse anymore. So, okay, get out of there and get to, okay, the right slide, and I'll plug it back in. Okay, this should work. And there we go. Okay, there's, got to be careful how when you touch an electronic device. If you touch it the wrong way, you live to regret it. So this is summary of some of the plot, mostly the background, the setting for that hideous strength. So more on the plot. Mark is drawn into this organization, the NICE. He discovers the truth of his wife's dreams, which he meets when he meets the literal head of Alcazan late in the story, which is being kept alive by infusions of blood. They think it's being kept alive. It's really not. Jane seeks help concerning her dreams. She's kind of spooked out by them. She's she's not spiritual. Neither of them have any association with the church, not Christian, maybe not even theists, but her dreams make her think that there's something about the supernatural. So she goes to a community called St. Anne's, where she meets Elwyn Ransom, whom we have met in the previous two stories. So I'm going to cut to the chase rather quickly. In the end, Merlin the magician, remember his name from the King Arthur stories, the Middle Ages. Once again, Lewis is doing some rehabilitation, and the angelic spirits of the planets other than Earth descend to Earth to save the day. Story ends in a final spectacular scene at the NICE headquarters where Merlin appears to confront the powers of hell, and it ends up being a reversal of Babel. You know, that hideous strength, it comes from Lindsay's poem about the Tower of Babel, and there is a banquet at the end of the story where all the people that work at the NICE are hearing different banquet speakers, and what they hear is gobbledygook. The speaker thinks he's speaking normal English, but it comes out in really kind of humorous ways, very, very funny. But the animals that the organization has been experimenting on are let loose, I think, by Merlin, and they wreak havoc, and there is death and destruction going on in this banqueting hall while Mark Studdock gets out of there. And at the end, Weston died on Perelandra. Divine dies in a landslide at the end of this story. Mark has an epiphany in the realization that he has neglected his wife. She's thinking the same thing about her husband, and they come together and enjoy one another's company and become Christians. THS is my abbreviation for That Hideous Strength and the Abolition of Man. By Lewis's own admission, That Hideous Strength is a novelistic embodiment of his 1943 book, 1943 lectures published in 1944, The Abolition of Man. And in fact, anybody ever read the Canadian Lutheran? Okay. The next issue has an article by yours truly. I've mentioned that in an earlier session, called C.S. Lewis on Objective Value. And this is the article. This is 1,300 words, 2 sides of 1 page. I printed 5 or 6 copies in case anybody's interested in getting a summary of the abolition of man, why it's important, and a little bit about its relationship to That Hideous Strength. You can read that article. It's also online at the LCC website. So Lewis says, this is a tall story, That Hideous Strength is a tall story about devilry, though it has a serious point which I have tried to make in my Abolition of Man. So there you have it. Without any ethical guidelines, objective values, objective truths, human beings become the objects of all sorts of experimentation and eugenics. Don't think, by the way, that eugenics is over and done with. Once the Nazi threat was eliminated, people aren't doing eugenics thinking at all anymore. It's not really the case. There are people who would love to bring back all kinds of experimentation on human beings. So Michael Eschliman wrote a book about the abolition of man. Excuse me, got my water here. It is this religion and this historical concentration of amoral knowledge and power of the few over the many and over nature itself that Lewis called That Hideous Strength. So Eschliman, one of the fine writers that wrote about the abolition of man. In the last chapter of That Hideous Strength, Mother Dimble, one of the characters, part of the company at St. Anne's, Camilla Deniston is also there, Jane Studdock are trying on clothing at St. Anne's. And at one point, Camilla puts on a dazzling robe and Mother Dimble states, "I'm afraid you must wear a crown with that one." How might, this is my rhetorical question, I guess, or we can talk about it. How might an understanding that you and I are created in the image of God affect our way of thinking or about the conditioning that Lewis opposes? Or a lot of other issues in life. What might it say about the sanctity of life, both at the beginning of life and at the end of life, the euthanasia movement in some circles, or the desire to euthanize Down syndrome children even before they're born, or to abort a child because it's an expense or an inconvenience. If it's just another form of life that doesn't happen to be as highly developed as the human being, well, it's disposable. Those are among the implications of rejecting the idea that we're created in the image of God. Were you going to say something, Farley?
Just what jumped to my mind, I don't know if this is we do not belong to ourselves. And these days, the zeitgeist is, yes, we are our own. To God. We are creatures.
Yes.
We are created.
Where did I read recently that some politician somewhere, I think on the North American continent, thought it was ridiculous that certain people were proposing that our rights ultimately come from God instead of from the state. She thought that that was crazy, that authority is ultimately vested in God. I'd take that as a non-negotiable, as a fact. And that also flows from the image of God. There's no surprise that one of the creation organizations in the States calls itself Answers in Genesis, because it's the disengagement with a lot of the teachings of the book of Genesis that leads to all kinds of crazy ideas being adopted in our schools and sometimes in our churches, in our public discourse. Yes?
We are to be in the world, but not of the world. I can't remember what the famous quote was in there.
Yeah, in the world but not of the world. Yeah, I think somebody famous said that, but might have been John in one of his epistles. I'm not sure. Anybody remember where that's from? Yeah, well, it is in the Bible. We can even narrow it down to the New Testament. In that hideous strength, Lewis writes, it must be remembered that in Mark's mind, this is Mark Studdock, the sociologist who's dying to get into the inner circle of this NICE, hardly one rag of noble thought, either Christian or pagan, had secure lodging. His education had been neither scientific nor classical, merely modern. The severities both of abstraction and of high human tradition had passed him by. He didn't study culture or history or philosophy, and he had neither peasant shrewdness nor aristocratic honor to help him. He was a man of straw, glib, examining, and subject to require no exact knowledge. He had done well on essays and general papers, and the first hint of a real threat to his bodily life knocked him sprawling. When he starts to resist the nice people, the not nice members of NICE, they don't like that, and they set him up to be accused of murder when they had actually murdered the one person at the NICE who was a good, honorable scientist, and they make it look like he's the murderer. All the while they're trying to gain access to his wife because they think if they can get to Merlin, they're pretty sure that Merlin is kind of in some suspended animation somewhere in the grounds of this college that they're inhabiting, that they can get to her, then they can get Merlin on their side, and he'll have superpowers that will advance their cause. So they're trying to get to her, and she doesn't like them. And Mark doesn't. He's really being protective of her. So he's learning to be more of a human being with a backbone than somebody who is simply trying to curry the favor of others who are above him that he wants to be close to. Kind of want to be in the in crowd. So his education wasn't a classical education, just modern, which isn't necessarily all that good. So he and one of his colleagues at the NICE are going to this beautiful small town area called Cure Hardy, and they're checking it out because they want to take over this space and do some building and get rid of the undesirable elements of that area. And so this is part of Studdock's awakening. They walked about that village for 2 hours and saw with their own eyes all the abuses and anachronisms they came to destroy. They saw the recalcitrant and backward laborer. Remember, there are no ordinary people, but for Studdock and Kosser, the laborer, we don't need to do anything with him, and heard his views on the weather. They met the wastefully supported pauper in the person of an old man shuffling across the courtyard of the almshouses to fill a kettle, and the elderly rentier, to make matters worse, she had a fat old dog with her, in earnest conversation with the postman. It made Mark feel as if he were on a holiday, for it was only on holidays that he had ever wandered about an English village. For that reason he felt pleasure in it. It did not quite escape him that the face of the backward laborer was rather more interesting than Kosser's, and a voice a great deal more pleasing to the ear. So they're in the process of writing an article about how to get rid of Cure Hardy to advance the cause of the NICE, and the people that he thinks are ordinary are really not. But he thinks of himself as coming more and more into this elitist society, a lot of whom are part of the NICE. So he's having a bit of an awakening when he's really honest with himself. So in the end, Kosser and Frost and all the other characters in that hideous strength, the bad guys, do meet their end. So let's step back from that hideous strength in the trilogy and talk a little bit about where Lewis got his sources for the things he writes in this trilogy, as well as some of his poetry in the Chronicles of Narnia and many other places, and the collection of essays called Rehabilitations, where he's trying to help restore people to an earlier way of thinking. I mean, he doesn't want to turn the clock back in terms of technological innovation, but he also wants people to be valued for what they are, not for their ability to be useful to the state or some elitists, or self-described elitists. So the King Arthur stories he loved from the Middle Ages, Chaucer's poetry that I have a lot of trouble with, but he was able to read the Old English and the Middle English, Anglo-Saxon, and these other languages that almost as a native. Beowulf, which Tolkien wrote a classic essay about Beowulf, who I think he describes as a Christian hero and a bit of a heroic, chivalrous figure in that classic Old English poem. So he liked Beowulf. He liked Dante's Divine Comedy, which has a very structured universe. A Romance of the Rose, Guillaume de Loris, Jean de Mun, not sure how you pronounce anything in French. I can't pronounce accurately, at least to satisfy the French. Works by John Gower, Thomas Usk, and John Lydgate. These are names that my guess is that none of you have ever heard of the three names in that bullet, but maybe I'm wrong. Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologica. Both Dante's comedy and Aquinas' theology are very ordered, structured, systematic, which was one of the features of the Middle Ages that were highly prized. And we live in an age of anarchy and disorder, and I think Satan loves it. I really do. Back to the Divine Comedy again with Hell, Purgatory, and Paradise. As you journey with this pilgrim, I guess you start with the levels of hell and rise through purgatory, ultimately to paradise. So what was attractive to Lewis in medievalism? He says it's artistic and aesthetic splendor. Scientifically, it was not accurate, but nevertheless he liked many aspects of medieval literature. The personalized society, we live to some extent in an impersonal society. Everybody's got a SIN number, and you're known by your credit card number, your debit card number. You're just sort of a faceless person in a vast society where more and more people are moving to the cities. The sense of order and hierarchy. The greatest tragedy in the ancient world, not only in the Middle Ages, but at the time of Joshua and Judges and those books of the Old Testament, the greatest tragedy was disorder, not suffering and pain, but disorder. And so they had a sense of order and hierarchy in the Middle Ages. There was a bond between church and the kings and aristocracy. Society honored chivalry, a chivalry that was tied to land and the world of nature. Ever notice how some of the most godly people you've ever met are farmers? They work the land. It's as though they were dependent upon God to send the rain, to allow the crops to build, and might seem to us to be drudgery or ordinary sort of life, but I've been impressed with people time and time again who work the land. So a little bit about Lewis and medievalism. I didn't talk about this, but when he gave his inaugural lecture at Cambridge University, he described himself as a dinosaur. He said, I read as a native the stories and the poetry of the Middle Ages that you have to read as foreigners, because I have immersed myself in that world and I know the literature of the Middle Ages as though I were an author in it. So he loved so much of the worldview that I just described in the previous slide. So much so that when he wrote his book, English Literature in the 16th Century, there's a 10 or 12 volume history of English literature that takes probably this much space on the shelf. I have just the volume that Lewis wrote, but it's the best-selling book in the volume, or in the series. It's about the age of the Renaissance, and he is said to have read everything that had been published in the English language in the 16th century that was still available at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. He refused to pass judgment or make comments about a writing that he had not himself read, which is not a bad position to adopt, to condemn something that you've never read simply because you think the guy that wrote it is not good. But he also kind of went overboard a little bit, and he argued that the Renaissance never happened, or that if it did, it was unimportant. And so he didn't like the word Renaissance. And it is true that he describes in his inaugural lecture at Cambridge that dividing history into periods is really a judgment that we make many years after, as we look back and we see how history changed. Certainly the age of the Reformation, those of us that are Lutherans have the advantage of a seminal event that took place on a particular date in a particular year in Wittenberg, Germany. And so to talk about the Reformation beginning in 1517, that's pretty accurate, even though it was coming on for a century. So the dividing line between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, he blurs a great deal, but he goes overboard and says, yeah, there really was no Renaissance. Except he describes in his book, English Literature in the 16th Century, the first part of the century is what he calls the age of drab literature, and then towards the end of the century, it's the flowering of literature with the age of Shakespeare, among others. And so it seems like he's contradicting himself. He doesn't like the word, but he can describe the advance of literature in that century. He wrote, his first great scholarly work was The Allegory of Love, that is still highly prized today. He studied allegorical literature on the subject of love in the Middle Ages, and wrote this book that, I'm not an English lit person, nor a medievalist, so I plowed through it once. I will probably never read it again. I will not recommend it to you, but hey, far be it from me to say don't do it. But anyway, it illustrates his appreciation of the literature of the Middle Ages. His book, The Discarded Image, which was a collection of notes based on his lectures at Oxford and Cambridge, is an attempt to rehabilitate the attitude that people in the Middle Ages had about life and God and relationships. And so, again, it's a difficult read, but for the specialist, I read high praise of both of these books, Allegory of Love and The Discarded Image, from people I respect. It's just that I can't read it and come to the same conclusion that they did, and I assume that that's a flaw in myself. But anyway, this does illustrate his efforts to help to recapture a God-centered world, a world of order, a world that's connected to the land and where people get along with one another, and certainly worthy causes. Both Narnia and the Ransom Trilogy are trying to recover that medievalism that Lewis loved. And so if we were to ask the question, I probably showed some of these slides, some of this data 7 years ago, and if you were in those sessions and you remember this, fine, tip of the hat to you. I don't remember if I did it or not, but I probably did. And if you were in that, you don't remember this at all, well, so much the better, because then I won't be repeating myself. So if we look at Lewis's fiction, both Narnia and Ransom Trilogy, language, the dress, the polity, geography and transportation, weaponry, cosmology, customs, creatures, astronomy, and clothing, they're all Middle Ages stuff. There are no mechanized vehicles, for instance, in Narnia or in the Ransom Trilogy. No machines. So language from the Middle Ages, I don't think I can define any of those words. I'd have to look them up because they're not part of my active vocabulary, but they're Middle Ages words. Clothing, silk and cloth of gold, snowy linen glancing through slashed sleeves, kind of dress of royalty too, gilt helmets, feathered bonnets, and Prince Caspian. Narnia is the definition, medieval definition of a kingdom. Geography, Narnia is flat, not spherical. Planets have influences in places like the Silver Chair. And I'm sure I talked about this 7 years ago, but did you know that there are 7 Chronicles of Narnia? This is about 98% certain, because there were 7 planets in the medieval cosmology, and Earth was not one of the 7, and the sun was, and the moon was. And you know why? Why the Middle Ages thought of that? Well, because the Earth was stationary in their view, and the sun and the moon and the other planets revolved around the Earth. You know what the word planet means? Wanderer. So if the Earth is stationary, it's not wandering. Obviously, it's not one of the planets. If the sun is wandering, it must be permissible to assign it the word planet. So anyway, and all the planets had influences in the Silver Chair. Astrology, the planetary influence, is reflected in the perspectives of Dr. Cornelius, who is the tutor of Prince Caspian, the centaur Glenstorm, and other centaur Runewit, that read the stars and could predict what was going to happen. Cartography, when Lewis writes to his illustrator, Pauline Baines, she did all the drawings for the Chronicles of Narnia. He wanted the map of Narnia to look more like a medieval map than an ordnance survey. So lots of medieval stuff there. Buildings, have castles, walled cities. Transportation, horseback, by ship, by bipedalism. Well, that means walking on 2 feet upright, in case you haven't run into that word before. So you walk, you ride a horse, you go on the water by ship. That's how you get, there are no airplanes, there are no automobiles. Military weaponry and clothing, I talked about clothing already a little bit. The catapult, the crossbow, bow and arrow, sword, likewise in Malacandra. So here is one of Pauline Baines' drawings of medieval clothing. Colorized, her drawings were all black and white, but when the 50th anniversary of the Chronicles of Narnia were reissued, they colorized all her drawings. Very nice. Creatures of Narnia are fauns and satyrs and tree nymphs, giants, gnomes, dwarves, dragons, centaurs. Deities of the Middle Ages, customs. Well, this one's not the exclusive property of the Middle Ages, but storytelling is one of them. Education, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the 4 cardinal virtues. There's Dr. Cornelius, at least according to Pauline Baines. And one other thing that's very big in the Middle Ages, the order of space. I talked about order already, but we also talked about Earth being in the center, therefore not one of the planets. It's motionless, doesn't move, surrounded by 7 hollow, perfect concentric circles. We now know that the orbits are elongated, so they're more ovals than perfect circles. But this is what they thought, because Kepler and Copernicus and Galileo hadn't done their work yet. Did you know Kepler was a Lutheran? Okay. Well, anyway. The lowest globe was the moon, then Mercury, then Venus, then the sun, then Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the sphere of the fixed stars, 7 globes, concentric circles. Then comes the primum mobile, then the empyrean, or the true heaven, which is the model in Dante's Divine Comedy. And so at the end of Perelandra, there's a dance, and the creatures of Perelandra are dancing, partly to celebrate the victory of Ransom over the big bad guy, Weston, but also because when the planets do their thing and revolve around the Earth, they sound that note, and the planets are in perfect harmony with one another, and the heavens are declaring the glory of God through a great dance. This is a drawing I found on the internet at some point. This was Aristotle's universe. So these perfectly round circles. And I put this note in there on the, both at the heading and also in the lower left. The word space wasn't used for the heavens until the 17th century, where the age of enlightenment and rationalism kicked in, and we didn't talk about the heavens, or they didn't talk about the heavens anymore, but began to talk about outer space. There's a really fabulous part early on in Out of the Silent Planet where where Ransom wakes up and he realizes he's on a spaceship with Weston and Devine. He overhears some of their conversation, figures out that they're going to offer him as a sacrifice, and resolves once they get to their destination, he's going to figure out how to escape from their clutches because he doesn't want to be offered as a sacrifice, even though that's not what the people of Malacandra wanted. But as they're going through space, he writes about how he had always thought, based on the writings of a scientist, that space was dead and cold and lifeless, and yet he feels like the territory that they are flying through is tingling with life, very, very much alive, and the light illuminates the spaceship that he's traveling in, and the very opposites of what is perhaps technically the accurate scientific description of outer space or the heavens. I sometimes think that nature or Mother Nature is also a term that secularists have adopted in order to avoid having to talk about the heavens. Well, okay, I won't get on that hobby horse. So also medieval, yeah, the great dance, talked about that a little bit, every planet in harmony and order with every other one, and yet still free within that. In the first two books of the trilogy, you have a chain of being, you have a hierarchy. At the top is, on the left-hand side, that's Perelandra's creatures. On the right-hand side, that's Malacandra. So the old one is up at the top. Does that ring a bell with any title in the scripture? The Ancient of Days. Yeah, read Daniel 7, for instance. So Lewis has a way of recasting familiar biblical concepts in new language. He doesn't talk about sin anywhere, but he talks about the bent one, things not being ordered like they are intended to be. Malaldil the Young is God the Son. The Oyarsa is the chief angel in charge of a given planet. Then below them are in Perelandra, it's the king, which is Tor, then the Green Lady, and then animals. On Valkandra, it's the Eldilla, which are lesser angelic creatures, then the Hanau, which are rational creatures, the three kinds, the Hrosa, the Fiffletriggy, and which is a funny word, Fiffletriggy, how did you come up with that? And then the Sorns. And then below them are the animals that they can hunt and fish for animals for food. So very ordered society in these unfallen worlds. Likewise, human personality. I had that slide at this point in the PowerPoint, but I moved it earlier in this PowerPoint for the sake of talking about Plato's influence and what Wesley Court said about Lewis seeing how the head rules the belly through the chest. And in a certain sense, it illustrates Lewis's strategy to reach the imagination first. And there are 9 classes of angels, according to the Middle Ages. Now, Scripture doesn't spell all this out, but you'll recognize some of the terms for angelic creatures. But this is how the medieval mind thought of it. So we got the name of the angelic creature on the left, and then their orientation. There are 3 sets of angels, 3 in each category. Does that sound a little bit Trinitarian? By the way, postscript, I've enjoyed getting to know Genesis 1 a great deal. Did you know, I'd love to do this lecture sometime at a Quest class. Did you know that I have counted 23 different groups of three in the first chapter of Genesis? God says, let there be 3 times. There are 3 passages where it talks about where the word for create out of nothing, bara, is used. And in the third instance, bara is used 3 times. There are 3 types of creatures: sea creatures, land creatures, flying creatures, and there are 3 purposes for the heavenly bodies to divide between the seasons and the months and the years, I think it is. Anyway, and I once asked myself, so why are there so many 3s in the first chapter of Genesis? Let me see. And we sometimes talk about the Trinity. God said, often God in the Old Testament is an equivalent for Father. He spoke the word, and then the Spirit hovered, like we often say. That's an echo of the Trinity. And then, of course, big one, when God says, let us make man in our own image. Who's he talking to? Because there aren't any human beings there. He's not talking to Adam and Eve yet. So anyway, that's an aside or a footnote that has nothing to do with C.S. Lewis. But there, except for the number 3, which we see in these 3 sets of 3 kinds of angels. So seraphim, cherubim, and thrones, all 3 of those terms appear in the Scripture. The seraphim are closest to God. Cherubim are looking Godward. The thrones are contemplating the divine essence. There's this passage in Ephesians, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. Those 2 words, one of which appears in this set of 3, are often described as ranks of evil angels. So the middle group, dominations, virtues, and powers. First group, they face God with their backs to the earth. Virtues are in the middle, powers potentially active. I'm not sure what that means, but that's what I read. And then the last 3, principalities, archangels, and angels. And so the top 3 are looking at God. The bottom 3 are looking at the world and the people that live in it. And the ones in the middle are kind of looking in both directions. So that's part of the order of the Middle Ages. And Lewis lays out some of that in his book, The Discarded Image. So we're down to my last 2 slides, and still open for questions. Trying to summarize things that are going on in this Ransom Trilogy that are great stories, just as stories in and of themselves. In fact, Lewis would say that about Narnia as well as the Ransom Trilogy. Read them for the story, for the plot, enjoy the story, identify with whatever characters you would like to identify with. But he also had more going on. But he's a literary person. He's an English professor. He loved to write. He loved to write stories. And so he would have been one of the first people to say, enjoy this story as story, because that's the way God wired us. And we learn from other people's stories, from their testimonies, from experiences they have that they share with us and the like. And the kinds of books that we read, I mean, who has... I better not go there. Anyway, there are certain kinds of literature that are easy to read and others that are more difficult, like textbooks in almost every academic subject area. I remember this is saying something about me, I remember being bored to tears reading a textbook for a sociology class that I had to take because it was required, and I just, I'm wired differently, let's put it that way. That's not anything against sociologists or Mark Studdock, but it does say that there are certain kinds of literature that we like better than others, and we're all unique individuals. So, in summary, two slides of about 10 or 12 points. The unity of spirit and matter, God, mankind, language, and reality, rather than separation and disjunction, dividing, it's bringing people and ideas together. Order and hierarchy versus disorder. We see that in how they understood space, how they understood music and the great dance. Everything is ordered. The angelic sphere, another example of that. The vitality of space, I mentioned that earlier. But space for Lewis is alive as opposed to cold and dead. I mean, I think the reality is it's cold and dead because we've sent people up there, and had they not had these suits that protected them from the cold and the vacuum, all that. They would have died in an instant or almost an instant if they had lost connection to their space station or to oxygen. Yeah, he's not arguing that the vitality of space is a scientifically accurate aspect of the Middle Ages. Discipline versus free spirit. Dave Ramsey says most every marriage consists of one nerd and one free spirit. One is really good with the finances and wants to know every single detail, and the other one is there to give the nerd something to do and to keep things under control. He says opposites attract, and that happens in family finance. That's not necessarily true, because Cheryl and I think a lot alike when it comes to finances. I won't tell you which one of the two we are, but you can probably guess that God-centered versus man-centered, a big deal. The reality of sin, right there in the midst of the Ransom Trilogy. Good and evil are clearly distinguished, although sometimes evil is depicted in very attractive ways, because that's what evil is like. It can look really tempting, it can look beautiful, handsome, it can be impressive to look at, but that doesn't tell you its core nature. Likewise, Lewis loved the creative majesty of the medieval mind and the way that the King Arthur stories spun a tale of nobility and adventure and chivalry and knights rescuing maidens in distress from burning castles and the like. Chivalry, the Knights of the Round Table, one of their highest duties is to be chivalrous. The aesthetic splendor of much of literature of the Middle Ages. And Lewis says, this is my last bullet, in The Discarded Image, he says, I made no serious effort to hide the fact that the old model delights me as I believe it delighted our ancestors. Few constructions of the imagination seem to me to have combined splendor, sobriety, and coherence in the same degree. And there you get a quote from one of the books that, I admit it bored me to tears, but nevertheless it says some important things, and this seems to be maybe a good way to wrap up this introduction to the Ransom Trilogy, and perhaps some of you will be motivated to pick up maybe the first, maybe you just want to read Perelandra, the story of the fall that didn't happen, or maybe you want to start at the beginning and see if it really is what Marjorie Hope Nicholson called the best, most beautiful space travel novel she'd ever read. Anyway, time for a few questions. Yes, David.
Yeah, with your comment or your assessment on the nerd and the free spirit, could it be that Katie Luther was the nerd and Martin Luther was the free spirit? And then also I'm thinking of Cheryl's the nerd and you're the free spirit.
Well, I mean, she's the musician. And aren't musicians supposed to be kind of free spirit, don't march to the same drummer, except there's a lot of order and symmetry and music. So I think we're both nerds, but I probably have a little more free-spiritedness in me than she does.
Music sort of drags you, it takes you.
Mm-hmm.
You try and control it, but I find it drags me or disappears.
It's mathematical.
It's mathematical, sets a powerful mood. People that are really good at music are also really good at mathematics, almost always. So there's a musical woman with a musical family, and there's another one, and maybe others could agree or disagree with that, but I think I've heard that, seen that. There's a musical guy too, so I don't know, do you think that's true or not? Maybe not as true as I think it is.
I used to be good at math.
Okay.
Still good at music, though.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Any other comments, questions? Yes.
Just a comment about one of the frustrations I have in higher education and just in our society in general is what he was reacting against is that there were lots of really good answers to questions that the medievals worked out in great detail, and everybody forgot because they just thought there was nothing of value there. And then people suddenly discover, oh, actually, this was worked out 800 years ago by somebody, right?
Yeah.
And if you read, I think it was especially Surprised by Joy, but you read some of his stuff, a lot of his detailed explanations of things, they are not, he's not being creative. He is simply conveying what was commonly believed and worked out in the past, and we had just forgotten about because nobody was reading it.
You know where I thought you were going? I agree with that totally. Where I thought you were going when you talked about academia was the tendency in academia to divide and compartmentalize and have subsets of almost every discipline ad infinitum, whereas the ability of the liberal arts to bring together a variety of skills and trainings in order to produce the educated person who can function in society, and some of the most practical education is that which trains young people in the liberal arts, in theology, philosophy, literature, poetry, music, mathematics, all those, what we consider to be the liberal arts. They work together into a harmonious whole, and we academics tend to divide things and not talk to each other.
Not modern, postmodern, higher education these days, there isn't really a belief in objective reality, so there isn't coherence. There's a fight against coherence, a fight against any kind of, well, we can't decide what is important and what's good, so let the student do whatever they want.
And
there's no coherence to it, and so they don't have coherent minds.
So is that an objective truth, that there is no such thing as objective
it is
reality?
Incoherent itself.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, if you want to read a little bit about the abolition of man and its defense of objective standards of things, we think truth is relative, we think beauty is in the eye of the beholder, we think goodness, that depends on who you are and how you look at things. No, there are some real objective characteristics of all of those, and that touches on it a little bit, but Thomas Korchak from Concordia Lutheran Theological Seminary in St. Catherine's also has an article on the same issue about, more broadly about goodness, truth, and beauty. Mine is more focused on the abolition of man and its contribution to that. This year is the 80th anniversary of the publication of the Abolition of Man, and I talked the editors of Sehnsucht, which is really the C.S. Lewis journal, into dedicating the issue for this year to the abolition of man. And so I'm not sure how soon that issue will come out, but that's the plan for the editors of Sehnsucht. All right, so I think we are
Great. Thank you.
done.
I don't know about you, but it's all a lot of alphabet soup, right? And he talked about C.S. Lewis and then changed C.L.S. That doesn't quite fit. Actually, that's the abbreviation for Concordia St. Louis, which we both graduated from, but we're Concordia Lutheran Seminary here. You may not realize that we're completing our 40th year here, and we'll have our 40th Sacred Convocation on May 24th. That's a grand celebration of God at work. We, over those 40 years, have been fully supported by our church body and a whole variety of people who provide donations and funding so that we can do what we do, including offer this Quest course. If you are one of those donors, presuming many of you are those donors, thank you. Thank you for everything that you do. And for the partnership you have. It's not just about the donation, it's the investment into the future of the church. It's the investment into the proclamation of the gospel, right? And the clarity of thinking that we all want to do in our culture and society, when it may seem easier to just dismiss some of the value of order for the chaos that seems to be triumphing sometimes. But we have a God of order, and we are thankful for that. So thank you for your support for us. Again, stay tuned because we'll be offering sort of Quest Fall, Quest Part 2 with Dr. Heck. But just want to say that what we do is all to the glory of God. And what our mission is about is forming servants, not for our own sake, not for the sake of C.S. Lewis even, but for Jesus' sake, and that everything we do points to him as our Lord and our Savior. And that's the precious truth that is even better than ransom. I don't know if that's a type, a post type of Christ, ransom. In that case, we can talk. I also want to ask you about that hideous strength and the whole Nazi regime. We can talk about that. I get to talk to him any day, right? I walk into his office and we get to talk, but you'll have a chance to see him in October. I'm going to ask Dr. Heck to have our closing prayer tonight. Dr. Heck, would you please?
We talk about forming servants here for Jesus' sake, but we know that every child of God is a servant in some sense, and each of us finds fulfillment when we live not simply for ourselves, but for others, especially for the God who made us. He gave us 10 commandments that are summarized with the words love God and love other people, and so we seek to do that, and as we love, we also serve. So thank you for the example of Lewis, who sought to serve, sought to bring people back to God through this appreciation of and advancing of the image of the medieval mindset. We pray that we would accumulate those sorts of concepts that would benefit us as we seek to be about your business in this world, even as Jesus was. We pray in the name of the King of Kings, but also the servant of servants, even Jesus Christ. Amen.
I hope you all have a safe trip home, a quiet evening's rest, and go about your day tomorrow serving Christ with joy and peace. And I don't know if everything has been put away. There's probably something, a sip if you want one for the road. Be careful out in the parking lot. It's slippery out there yet. We have what looks like Father Christmas visited here, but it's good. Anyway, thank you for coming. Thank you again, Dr. Heck. And go in peace. Serve the Lord.